It is the autumn of 1943, somewhere in occupied France. A German sentry stands at his post near a crossroads outside a small village. The night is cold and still. He lights a cigarette, cups his hands against the wind, and exhales a long breath into the darkness. He hears nothing. He sees nothing. He feels nothing, because the bullet that ends his life arrives before the sound that fired it. One moment he is standing, the next he is not. 40 meters away, in the shadows beneath a hedgerow, a figure rises, checks the road in both directions, and moves silently on into the night. The other sentries, 30 paces distant, have heard nothing at all, nothing but the wind. The weapon responsible for that silence was not a miracle of American engineering or a product of German precision manufacture. It was British. Quietly, unfussily, almost embarrassingly British. It was called the Delisle carbine. And for those who carried it behind enemy lines, it was not so much a firearm as it was a whisper made lethal. Today, the Delisle carbine is largely forgotten outside enthusiast circles and specialist historians. It does not appear on war memorials. It is not celebrated in the same breath as the Spitfire or the Lancaster bomber. There are no stirring films built around it, no popular mythology. And yet, in the shadow war that Britain fought from 1941 onwards, the clandestine war of agents, saboteurs, and specially trained killers, this unassuming weapon arguably did more per round fired than almost anything else in the British arsenal. It was, by every objective measure, the most effective suppressed firearm ever produced during the Second World War. Possibly the most effective suppressed firearm ever produced by any nation, in any war, before or since. This is the story of how it came to exist, how it worked, and what it was used for. It is also the story of a particular kind of British ingenuity, the kind that does not shout about itself, that prefers results to reputation, and that is most at home operating in the dark. To understand why the Delisle existed, you must first understand what came before it, and why what came before it was not good enough. By 1940, the British military was acutely aware that it was fighting a different kind of war to the one it had trained for. The fall of France in June of that year had been a catastrophic shock to Allied strategy. Suddenly, vast swathes of Western Europe were under German occupation, and the question facing Churchill's government was not simply how to defeat the enemy in open battle, but how to make his occupation as painful and as costly as possible in the meantime. The answer was unconventional warfare, sabotage, assassination, intelligence gathering, and the support of resistance movements across occupied territories. The Special Operations Executive was established in July 1940 with Churchill's famous instruction to set Europe ablaze. But setting Europe ablaze quietly required specialized tools. The SOE's agents could not walk around occupied Paris or Amsterdam carrying standard-issue Lee Enfield rifles. They needed weapons that were concealable, reliable, and above all, silent. The German occupiers were efficient and ruthless. A single shot that could be heard half a mile away was the difference between a successful operation and a Gestapo roundup. The British already had suppressed weapons, of course. The Sten submachine gun had been fitted with a suppressor, the so-called silent Sten, and it was better than nothing. But it was chambered in 9mm, a subsonic cartridge only when loaded with special ammunition, and the mechanism of the weapon itself, the bolt cycling back and forth, the clanging of metal against metal, created enough mechanical noise to be audible at distances that made close-quarter work uncomfortably risky. Agents who used it described the sound as resembling someone rapidly shuffling a deck of thick cards, distinctive enough, in a silent street, to draw attention. And in occupied Europe, attention meant death. What was needed was something fundamentally different. Not a suppressor bolted onto an existing weapon as an afterthought, but a weapon designed from first principles around the requirement of silence. Something that eliminated not just the muzzle blast, but every other source of noise in the firing cycle. something that would allow a trained man to fire, and the only sound audible would be the soft mechanical click of the action. Something, in short, that did not yet exist. The man who designed it was a civilian engineer named William Godfrey Delisle. He was working for the Air Ministry when the project began, which gives some indication of the oblique, interdepartmental manner in which British special weapons development tended to operate during the war. Delisle was not a military man. He was a practical engineer with a particular interest in ballistics, and when he turned his attention to the problem of silent firearms, he approached it with the methodical clarity of someone unencumbered by military convention. The solution he arrived at was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. The Delisle carbine was built around the action of the Lee-Enfield rifle, the standard British infantry weapon, but it was rechambered to fire the American .45 ACP pistol cartridge. This single decision was the key to everything that followed. The .45 ACP, the same round used in the American Thompson submachine gun and the Colt 1911 pistol, is a large, heavy, slow-moving bullet. It travels at roughly 259 meters per second, which is comfortably subsonic. The speed of sound in air is approximately 343 meters per second at sea level. A bullet traveling faster than that creates its own sonic boom, a sharp crack that is entirely separate from the explosion at the muzzle and that cannot be suppressed by any silencer, regardless of how well engineered. By choosing the .45 ACP, Delisle eliminated this problem entirely. The bullet left the barrel slowly enough that it would never break the sound barrier. But Delisle did not stop there. He then designed an integral suppressor, not a device screwed onto the end of the barrel, but a suppressor that formed part of the barrel itself, running along its entire length. The suppressor consisted of a series of baffles, internal chambers that the propellant gases had to pass through after the bullet left the bore. Each baffle robbed the gases of some of their energy and pressure, cooling and slowing them, so that by the time they emerged from the muzzle they were at a fraction of the pressure they would otherwise have been. The result was a muzzle report so quiet that witnesses who tested the weapon described it as sounding like a cupboard door being gently closed. Others likened it to the sound of a staple gun. In the open air, in the dark, at any distance greater than 20 or 30 meters, it was essentially inaudible. The finished weapon was compact enough, approximately 89 centimeters in overall length, weighing roughly 3.7 kilograms when loaded. It fed from a 7-round magazine that was a modified version of the Colt 1911 pistol magazine, another example of elegant improvisation. The Lee-Enfield bolt action, a mechanism renowned for its smoothness, could be cycled with a minimum of mechanical noise if the operator took care. The entire firing cycle, the trigger pull, the firing, the bolt operation, the ejection of the spent case, produced a total sound signature that was extraordinary in its quietness. The loudest noise, according to those who tested it extensively, was the sound of the empty brass cartridge case falling onto a hard floor. Production of the Delisle carbine was handled primarily at the Sterling Engineering Company in Dagenham, East London. A further variant, designed to fold for easier concealment and parachute drops, was produced in smaller numbers. Exact production figures remain a matter of some debate among historians. Official records were incomplete, and some quantities were classified and remained so for decades. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 129 and 500 examples were manufactured in total across all variants. It was never a weapon produced in large numbers. It did not need to be. The Delisle carbine was issued almost exclusively to units and individuals engaged in covert operations. The Special Operations Executive was the primary recipient, though the Special Air Service and other raiding parties also made use of it. Documenting its operational use is, by the nature of the work it was used for, a challenge. SOE operations were conducted in secrecy, records were often destroyed, and the agents who carried these weapons frequently operated under cover identities that make individual accounts difficult to attribute. What is known, however, is that the carbine saw active use in occupied France in the Far East, particularly in operations in Burma and Malaya, and in various other theaters where British special forces were operating. Resistance fighters and SOE agents used it for what the euphemistic language of clandestine warfare termed executive action, the killing of specific individuals. Sentries were removed. Collaborators were eliminated. Couriers and dispatch riders were ambushed on isolated roads. In each case, the extraordinary silence of the weapon allowed the operator to fire and withdraw before anyone nearby had any reliable sense of what had happened or from which direction. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. One account, cited in post-war SOE documentation, describes an agent in France who fired 3 times from a position in a small wood, killing 2 German soldiers at approximately 40 meters before walking calmly away along a footpath. A third German, present at the scene, initially believed his colleagues had simply fallen. It was only when he bent to assist them that the situation became apparent to him. By that time, the agent was gone. In Burma, the weapon's utility in jungle conditions was particularly appreciated. The dense vegetation of the Burmese theater created its own acoustic environment, but it also meant that operations frequently took place at very close range. The Dalil's combination of utter silence and the significant stopping power of the .45 ACP round made it well suited to the close-range, intimate violence of jungle warfare. Germany, for its part, had its own program of suppressed weapons development, though it never produced anything that matched the Dalil's overall performance. The Germans developed suppressed versions of the Walther P-38 pistol and experimented with suppressed variants of the Mauser rifle, but these were compromises, standard weapons adapted rather than purpose-built solutions. The Wehrmacht was fundamentally a conventional army, and its suppressed weapon development reflected that priority. Individual items produced in limited numbers for specific units, rather than the result of the kind of first principles engineering that had produced the Dalil. The Americans developed the high-standard model HD pistol with a suppressor for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the American equivalent of the SOE. It was quieter than a standard pistol and effective enough at very close range, but it was chambered in .22 long rifle, a small caliber cartridge with limited stopping power. Where the American weapon required multiple well-placed shots to reliably incapacitate a target, the British .45 ACP round was a dramatically more powerful proposition. The trade-off the Americans made, more silence for less power, was a different calculation to the one Dalil had arrived at, and most analysts who have studied both weapons consider the British carbine the more effective combat tool. There were also suppressed Sten variants, the well-rod pistol, another British design, almost entirely silent, bolt action, designed for single-shot use at point-blank range, and various experimental devices produced by SOE's workshops at Station 9 at the Fryth in Hertfordshire. The well rod, in particular, was an extraordinarily effective, silent killing tool, but it was designed for a single shot at arm's length and then disengaged, an assassin's tool rather than a soldier's weapon. The Dalil occupied a different position. It could be used at ranges up to perhaps 100 meters, it held 7 rounds, and it could be fired repeatedly without anyone nearby being the wiser. In the broader context of suppressed weapons development, no nation during the Second World War produced a weapon that matched the Dalil carbine's combination of silence, accuracy, magazine capacity, and effective range. It was a genuine technological achievement. Assessing the Dalil carbine's impact on the war as a whole is difficult, precisely because the operations it was used in were designed to leave no trace. The SOE's war was a war of shadows, and the accounting of its effects remains contested by historians to this day. What the carbine contributed was not measurable in tons of shipping sunk or aircraft destroyed. Its contribution was measured in sentries who never raised the alarm, in operations that were not compromised at the critical moment, in agents who reached their objectives and came home. There is also the psychological dimension to consider. The knowledge that British agents were operating in occupied territories with a weapon that was effectively undetectable, that a German soldier could be killed in a public place and no one within earshot would realize it had happened, was deeply unsettling to German security forces. It contributed to a climate of uncertainty and anxiety among occupying forces that consumed manpower and resources in defensive measures, intelligence sweeps, and the kind of paranoid overreaction that disrupts the efficient functioning of any military administration. The DeLisle carbine influenced post-war thinking about suppressed firearms considerably. The principle it demonstrated that a weapon designed from the ground up around the requirement of silence, using inherently subsonic ammunition, would dramatically outperform a standard weapon fitted with an afterthought suppressor became a foundational principle of modern suppressor design. Contemporary military and law enforcement suppressed weapons still operate on the same essential logic. Today, surviving DeLisle carbines are rare and highly prized by collectors. Examples can be found in the collections of the Imperial War Museum in London, the Royal Armouries at Leeds, and in various private collections. They are inert, handled carefully by curators who understand that they represent something unusual in the history of British arms. A weapon that achieved exactly what it set out to achieve, that was used precisely as intended, and that left almost no trace of its existence in the historical record, which is, of course, exactly as its operators would have wanted. Return to that autumn night in occupied France, the sentry by the crossroads, the cigarette cupped against the wind, the silence. What the DeLisle carbine represented was more than a technical achievement. It was the physical embodiment of a particular kind of British wartime thinking, pragmatic, ruthless, understated. While Germany built weapons to inspire awe, great thundering machines that announced themselves across miles of landscape, Britain built weapons that did their work and disappeared. While the American industrial complex produced firearms in their millions, Britain sat in a workshop in Hertfordshire and asked a different question. Not how many can we make, but how precisely can we solve this specific problem? The answer was a weapon that weighed less than 4 kilograms, held 7 rounds, and produced less noise than a car door closing gently in a quiet street. The men who carried it behind enemy lines were volunteers, many of them civilians in their former lives, schoolteachers, solicitors, engineers, farmers, who had answered an oblique advertisement or an even more oblique conversation and found themselves months later in the dark, in occupied Europe, carrying a weapon that gave them the capability of ghosts. They were not, for the most part, professional killers. They were ordinary people who had been given an extraordinary tool and the training to use it, and sent to do a job that the conventional military could not do. The DeLisle carbine did not win the war. No single weapon does. But it made possible a category of operation that would otherwise have been too risky to attempt, and in doing so it freed the shadow war to operate at a tempo and an effectiveness that would not otherwise have been achievable. It has been argued by historians of special operations that the SOE's campaigns in occupied Europe, the sabotage of rail lines, the assassination of key personnel, the supply and organization of resistance movements, added months to the German ability to resist the Allied advance, and by the same token reduced the cost in Allied lives of eventual liberation. If that argument holds, then the DeLisle carbine, in its small, quiet, unassuming way, contributed to the liberation of Europe with less noise than any other weapon that fired a shot in anger between 1939 and 1945. It was British, it was brilliant, and it was silent, and the best thing it ever did was nothing you could hear.